So now that we've talked about the handy microservice, let's turn our attention to the Zippy microservice structure and functionality. And you'll see that unlike what we did before, where we did everything using the mechanisms available with parallel and sequential fluxes, this approach uses the Java persistence architecture, JPA. And the microservice implementation also showcases the use of Java parallel and sequential streams in conjunction with the JPA. And we'll talk a bit about the JPA as we go along. So this is the entry point application. Zippy application extends base application, just like handy application did. And it has a main method that uses the inherited run method from base application to go ahead and start up the Zippy application. By the way, when you call the run call here, just for your edification, what actually happens under the hood is it takes a look at this class file, and it goes through and it does all the various dependency management, like dependency injection and auto wiring, and uses bean factor methods to make the bean instances and so on and so forth. So that's what's happening when you do run. It's going ahead and kind of expanding and resolving all the dependencies. So let's talk about the ZippyController. Again, super duper simple. ZippyController extends the base controller like we did with handy controller, and it has a list of quotes as the return value. Not a whole lot to say here other than this is just what we did before, so I won't dwell on it. What I will dwell on, however, is the quote repository. This is something new that we haven't talked about so far. So the quote repository is going to be a persistent repository implemented using the Java persistence architecture that's going to contain information about quote objects. So this is going to allow us to do things in a persistent way, and I'll talk more about what that means in a second. So the quote repository extends JPA repository, which provides a boatload of methods for basic create, read, update, delete, or CRUD operations. So these would be things like saving, finding all, finding by ID, finding all by ID, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that enable Java programs to interact with a persistent database without having to write any SQL code, or writing very little SQL code. Sometimes you can't quite do it with what they have out of the box, but you can then jump over and write your own queries if you want. So JPA repository is parameterized by quote and an integer. So the integer is the ID, and the quote is the string that we've seen so far. So this method here, find by quote containing ignore case, this method is automatically generated. And this is the absolute magic of the JPA. So if you're in the IDE, if you're in IntelliJ IDE, and you start typing stuff like find by, you can basically have it auto-expand to tell you what it can handle, and it will then automatically generate this method. Now, there's a bunch of methods that come out of the box from JPA repository, but this is one that we define that is specifically going to be used to find all the quote rows in the database that contain the query string while ignoring case. So what we're doing here, we're saying find by quote. Quote is the second field. You have ID followed by quote. That's the actual string. Find by quote that contains this query and ignore the case. So super powerful. When your needs match what the JPA and IntelliJ do for you, it is a wonderful world of happiness and flowers and rainbows and unicorns and so on, because there's very little, if anything, you have to do. So let's now talk about the structure and functionality of the Zippy service that uses the quote repository that we just saw. So here is the Zippy service. Zippy service extends the base service, and then it parameterizes it with a list of quotes. And then it's defined as a service, so it can do all the auto detection and wiring and so on. And here's the thing that it's auto wiring. It's auto wiring the quote repository. So that repository we just saw that knew how to load up things that relate to Zippy quotes and so on are what will be used here as the field in the service. And now let's take a look at some of the methods that are defined in this. And there are different ways to do services and database. If you just use the built-in methods directly, you don't even really need a service. You just have to have the repository directly. In this case, we do have one extra thing for one of the methods, so we made a service. So here's get all quotes. And you can see in the Zippy microservice implementation, we simply forward to the repository and say, find me all the quotes. And find all is predefined. It's a predefined operator that comes from the JPA repository. You don't have to do anything to get it. It just gives you back everything in the table. Here's the getQuotes method. It should actually be called postQuotes, but we can call it getQuotes for the time being. And what that does is that's going to use the find all by ID method that's part of the repository. So the repository has a way of being able to find all the entries that match the list of quote IDs that are passed in here. So we pass in the quote IDs, and then that'll go ahead and find all the queries that match the quote IDs. And then finally, we have the search method, and this is going to take a list of string queries and a Boolean parameter, and it's going to use the JPA in order to be able to search to find everything that matches. Now, this is a very interesting method, and you can see a couple things. We're going to talk about it in more detail when we walk through the code in just a second, but I just wanted you to be aware of the overall approach. The overall approach is we're either going to do this sequentially or in parallel, depending on the parallel flag we pass in, and then we're going to go ahead and use that find by quote containing ignore case method to go ahead and look up and see if we can get a match, and then we connect all the pieces together. So that's the end of the quick walkthrough of the structure and functionality of how this stuff works.